The cold winter wind howled through the streets of Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory, as Victoria Hayes clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, one hand protectively resting on her swollen belly. Her fingers trembled, not just from the biting December chill of 1878, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into her very soul after being turned away from yet another door. "We don't take in strangers," the woman had said, her eyes cold as she glanced at Victoria's pregnant belly and the simple gold band on her finger. "Especially not in your condition." Victoria fought back tears as she trudged down the muddy Main Street. 3 months a widow, 7 months with child, and not a friend in this dusty frontier town. Her money was nearly gone, her husband Thomas buried in a simple grave 200 miles east after the stagecoach robbery that had claimed his life. She had continued west, following their original plan to reach Santa Rosa, where Thomas had purchased land for their new life, only to discover upon arrival that the deed had been lost in the robbery. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Victoria's stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten since morning, a meager breakfast of stale bread she'd been saving. The baby kicked, as if protesting the lack of nourishment. One more house stood at the edge of town, a modest cabin with a small barn behind it. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Victoria hesitated, the memory of all the previous rejections still stinging. But with night approaching and nowhere to sleep, she had no choice, her knuckles rapped weakly against the wooden door. For a long moment, there was silence and Victoria's heart sank. Then came the sound of boots on floorboards and the door swung open. A tall man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from within. He wore a simple flannel shirt, work-worn trousers, and a weathered cowboy hat that he removed as soon as he saw her. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, with kind eyes that widened at the sight of her condition. "Madam," he questioned, taking in her exhausted appearance and the visible swell of her belly. Victoria summoned the last of her strength. "Sir, I hate to impose, but I've tried every other house in town. I'm in need of shelter for the night. I can pay a little, and I'll be gone by morning." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze softening as he noticed how she swayed slightly on her feet from fatigue. Without hesitation, he stepped aside and gestured into the warmth of his home. "Welcome," he said simply. The single word nearly broke her. After a day of cold stares and closed doors, this stranger's kindness was almost too much to bear. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping across the threshold into warmth and safety. "Name's Matthew Westbrook," he said, closing the door against the cold. "And you look like you could use a hot meal and a place to rest." Victoria nodded gratefully, finally allowing herself to believe that perhaps her luck had changed. "Victoria Hayes," she replied. "And yes, I believe I could." Neither of them could have known in that moment how that simple act of kindness would forever alter the course of their lives. Matthew quickly took Victoria's worn carpetbag and helped her to a chair near the fireplace. The cabin was simple but clean, one main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, and a curtained-off sleeping area. It was the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. "When was the last time you ate, Mrs. Hayes?" Matthew asked, immediately moving to the small stove where a pot of stew simmered. "This morning," Victoria admitted, the warmth of the fire already beginning to thaw her frozen limbs. "And please call me Victoria." Matthew nodded, ladling a generous portion of stew into a bowl. "Victoria," he said, testing the name as he handed her the food and a spoon. "Eat slowly now. Your stomach needs time to adjust." She took the bowl with trembling hands, inhaling the rich aroma of beef and vegetables. "You're very kind, Mr. Westbrook." "Matthew," he corrected with a small smile, pouring her a cup of coffee, "and kindness is free. Seems there's been a shortage of it in your day." Victoria took a careful spoonful of the stew, closing her eyes briefly at the first hot food she'd had in days. "I arrived in Santa Rosa this morning," she explained between bites. "My husband Thomas and I were heading west to settle on land he purchased here, but he was killed 3 months ago. Stagecoach robbery." Matthew's expression grew somber. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that. The deed to our land was lost in the robbery. I came anyway, hoping—" Victoria's voice faltered. "Hoping for what? I'm not sure anymore. A new start, I suppose." Matthew sat across from her, his own bowl untouched as he listened. In the firelight, Victoria could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair and a strong jaw softened by compassionate blue eyes. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his movements were gentle. "And no one would take you in." There was a note of disbelief in his voice. Victoria gave a bitter smile. "A pregnant widow without family or connections is not considered respectable company, Mr. Westbrook." "Matthew," he reminded her again, his brow furrowing, "and that's a poor reflection on this town, not on you." Victoria finished her stew in silence, grateful for both the food and his lack of judgment. When she was done, Matthew took the bowl and refilled it without asking. She wanted to decline to not appear greedy, but the baby kicked again, reminding her that she was eating for two. "Thank you," she said, accepting the second helping. Matthew nodded, finally eating his own meal. "I've got a small room in the back," he said between bites. "Used to be for storage, but I cleared it out last year and put a bed in there. It's yours for as long as you need." Victoria nearly dropped her spoon. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Matthew interrupted firmly. "Winter's setting in, and you're in no condition to be searching for lodgings. I won't hear of you leaving until you've got proper arrangements made." His tone left no room for argument, and Victoria found herself too exhausted to protest. "I insist on paying you then. I have some money set aside." Matthew shook his head. "We'll discuss that later. For now, you need rest." After they finished eating, Matthew showed her to the small room. It was indeed modest, just space for a narrow bed, a small table, and a chest for clothing, but it was clean, with fresh linens and a thick quilt. "Bathroom's out back," he said apologetically. "I keep a chamber pot in here for nighttime." He gestured to the ceramic vessel tucked discreetly under the bed. "I'll give you privacy now. If you need anything, just call." Victoria stood in the middle of the small room after he left, overwhelmed by the sudden turn in her fortune. From the verge of spending a night in the cold to being offered shelter by this kind stranger. She sat heavily on the bed, her hand resting on her belly. "We're safe for tonight," she whispered to her unborn child. For the first time since Thomas died, Victoria allowed herself to cry freely, tears of relief, grief, and exhaustion all mingling together as she laid her head on the pillow and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came with the scent of coffee and bacon. Victoria woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly, smoothing her hair and straightening her dress as best she could before emerging into the main room. Matthew was at the stove, his back to her as he turned bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," he said without turning. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Victoria admitted, surprised to realize it was true. "How did you know I was awake?" Matthew glanced over his shoulder with a small smile. "Floorboards creak. Occupational hazard of being a light sleeper out here." He gestured to the table where coffee was already poured. Breakfast is almost ready. Victoria sat, cradling the warm mug between her hands. You didn't have to cook for me. I was cooking for myself anyway, he replied with a shrug, transferring bacon to a plate and cracking eggs into the remaining fat. No trouble making extra. They ate together in comfortable silence. Victoria studied her host in the morning light. He was handsome in a rugged way, though there was a sadness in his eyes that she recognized the look of someone who had known loss. "What do you do, Matthew?" she asked, breaking the silence. "I raise horses," he answered. "Got a small ranch just outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it pays the bills. I break and train them for the army mostly, some for private buyers." Victoria nodded. "And you live here alone?" Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow of old pain. "Yes, madam, just me." Before she could inquire further, a knock came at the door. Matthew rose to answer it, revealing a stout woman with gray streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. "Morning, Mrs. Carmichael," Matthew greeted her. The woman barely acknowledged him, her gaze fixed on Victoria. "So it's true," she said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "You've taken in the widow." Matthew's posture stiffened. "Mrs. Hayes needed shelter." "There's a boarding house in the next town," Mrs. Carmichael said pointedly. 15 miles away," Matthew countered. "Hardly appropriate for a woman in her condition." Mrs. Carmichael sniffed. "Propriety seems to be of little concern to either of you." Victoria felt her cheeks flush with indignation and embarrassment. She started to rise, intending to defend herself, but Matthew spoke first. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said, his voice level but edged with steel, "I believe you've mistaken my home for your church pulpit. Mrs. Hayes is my guest, and that's all the explanation you're owed." The older woman's mouth thinned to a hard line. "The town has standards, Mr. Westbrook." "And I have mine," he replied, his hand already closing the door. "Good day to you." The door shut with finality, and Matthew turned to Victoria with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry about that." Victoria shook her head, still stinging from the woman's implications. "I should leave. I don't want to cause trouble for you." "Nonsense," Matthew said firmly. "Mrs. Carmichael appointed herself the town's conscience years ago. No one elected her." "Still," Victoria persisted, "your reputation is my own concern," he finished. "Now, what are your plans?" "You mentioned land your husband purchased." Recognizing his attempt to change the subject, Victoria allowed it. "Yes, though without the deed, I have no proof. The land office had no record when I inquired yesterday." Matthew considered this. "Who did he buy it from? Do you know?" "A man named Crawford, I believe. James or Joseph Crawford." Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly. "Joseph Crawford, tall fellow, red beard." Victoria's heart quickened. "Yes, that sounds right. Thomas corresponded with him for months." Matthew nodded slowly. "I know him. He has a spread about 5 miles north. Sold off parcels of his ranch last year when cattle prices dropped." He stood decisively. "We'll ride out there today, see if he remembers the sale." "We?" Victoria questioned. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here and entertain more visitors like Mrs. Carmichael," Matthew said with a wry smile. Despite herself, Victoria laughed. "When you put it that way, a ride sounds wonderful." Within the hour, Matthew had saddled 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding for himself and a gentle mare for Victoria. He helped her mount, careful of her condition, then swung easily into his own saddle. "It's been a while," Victoria admitted, adjusting her skirts. "Not since before." She gestured to her belly. "Maisie's gentle as a lamb," Matthew assured her. "Just follow my lead." They rode at an easy pace, Matthew shortening his horse's naturally longer stride to stay beside her. The day was clear and crisp, the winter sun bright, but offering little warmth. The landscape around Santa Rosa was mostly flat, with rolling hills in the distance and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking the path of a creek or river. "How long have you lived here?" Victoria asked as they rode. "Almost 10 years now," Matthew replied. "Came west after the war with what little I had and started building." "You fought in the war," he nodded, his expression growing distant. "Union cavalry. Spent most of it in Tennessee and Georgia." Victoria sensed there was more to the story, but Matthew's tone discouraged further questions. They rode in silence for a while until he spoke again. "What about you? Where were you before?" "St. Louis," she answered. "Thomas was a bookkeeper for a mercantile company. We married 3 years ago." She smiled faintly at the memory. He always dreamed of having his own land, being his own master. When he heard about opportunities out west, he couldn't resist. "And you agreed to come?" There was no judgment in Matthew's voice, only curiosity. Victoria nodded. "I loved him, and there was nothing holding me in St. Louis. My parents died years ago, and I was working as a seamstress. The idea of a fresh start appealed to me too." They crested a small rise, and Matthew pointed ahead where a modest ranch house stood, smoke curling from its chimney. "Crawford's place," he said. "Let's hope he remembers your husband." As they approached, a tall man with a red beard emerged from a barn, shading his eyes against the sun. Recognition crossed his face as they drew closer. "Westbrook," he called in greeting. "What brings you out this way?" Matthew dismounted, then helped Victoria down. "Crawford, this is Mrs. Victoria Hayes. Her husband Thomas purchased land from you last year, but the deed was lost when he was killed during their journey west." Crawford's expression sobered. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry for your loss." He studied her face. "Thomas Hayes. Yes, I remember the correspondence. Sold him the south parcel, 160 acres with water rights to the creek." Victoria's heart leapt. "Then you remember the sale?" Crawford nodded. "Of course. Paid in full, as I recall. I've got the records in the house." He gestured for them to follow him inside. Crawford's wife, a plump, pleasant-faced woman, immediately offered them coffee while her husband searched through a desk in the corner of their living room. After several minutes, he produced a ledger and a folder of papers. "Here we are," he said, opening the folder. "Hayes, Thomas. Full payment received March 15, 1878, for the south parcel." He looked up at Victoria. "I've got a copy of the deed here that I kept for my records. We can take this to the county office and have them issue you a new one." Tears sprang to Victoria's eyes. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Crawford." "No thanks needed, madam. It's your land, fair and square." He glanced at her condition. "Though if you don't mind my saying so, that's a lot of work for a woman in your situation." Before Victoria could respond, Matthew spoke up. "Mrs. Hayes will have help. The community will see to that." Crawford nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good to hear. Town should look after its own." He handed the papers to Victoria. "The land's good. Creek doesn't dry up even in summer, and there's enough flat ground for a decent-sized garden. Your husband chose well." They stayed for lunch at Mrs. Crawford's insistence, and it was mid-afternoon by the time they started back to town. Victoria clutched the precious papers, her mind whirling with possibilities and challenges. She had landed her land now, but Crawford was right. Building a life there alone, especially with a baby coming, seemed impossible. "You're quiet," Matthew observed as they rode. "I'm thinking about what Mr. Crawford said," Victoria admitted. "He's right. I can't work that land alone, especially not now." Matthew was silent for a moment. "You have options," he said finally. "You could sell it, or lease it out for a few years until your child is older." Victoria considered this. "Selling feels like giving up on Thomas's dream, and our dream, really." "Then don't sell," Matthew said simply. "Like I told Crawford, you'll have help." "I meant that." Victoria looked at him in surprise. "You barely know me." Matthew smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "I'm a good judge of character, Mrs. Hayes, and out here neighbors help neighbors. It's how we survive." They reached town as the sun was beginning to set. As they approached Matthew's cabin, Victoria noticed several people watching them from porches and windows. News of her staying with Matthew had clearly spread. "Don't mind them," Matthew said, noticing her discomfort. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." Inside, Matthew built up the fire while Victoria sat at the table, studying the papers from Crawford. According to the deed, the land included a small, existing cabin, little more than a one-room shelter, Crawford had explained, built by a trapper years ago. It would need work to be livable, especially with winter settling in. "Tomorrow we'll go to the county office and make everything official," Matthew said, joining her at the table. "Then we can ride out to see your property." Victoria nodded gratefully. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he assured her. "But I've been thinking, that cabin of yours will need work before it's fit for a woman and child. You're welcome to stay here until it's ready." Victoria hesitated. "That's incredibly generous, but after Mrs. Carmichael this morning, I don't want to be the cause of more gossip." Matthew waved a dismissive hand. "People will talk regardless. Better they talk while you have a roof over your head." "Still," Victoria persisted, "perhaps there's an arrangement we could come to. I noticed your shirts could use mending and I'm an excellent cook. I could earn my keep that way." Matthew studied her thoughtfully. "You don't need to earn your keep, Victoria. But if it makes you more comfortable, I won't refuse the help." A smile touched his lips. "Especially the cooking part. I've been living on my own stew for longer than I care to admit." Victoria returned his smile, relief washing over her. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. She had land, she had shelter, and somehow, against all odds, she had found a friend in this quiet cowboy who had opened his door when no one else would. The following days fell into a rhythm. Matthew and Victoria rode to the county office the next morning and had a new deed issued in her name. The clerk raised his eyebrows at her condition, but made no comment, with Matthew standing protectively beside her. Afterward, they visited her land, a beautiful parcel with a small, dilapidated cabin nestled among cottonwoods near a clear running creek. "It needs work," Matthew assessed, examining the cabin's sagging roof and broken windows, "but the structure is sound. We can have it habitable before your little one arrives." Victoria walked the property, emotions overwhelming her. This was to have been her home with Thomas, their new beginning. Now it would be her beginning alone, or not entirely alone. She corrected herself, her hand resting on her belly. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thomas would have loved it." Matthew gave her space, seeming to understand her need to process her grief alongside her hope. When she was ready, they returned to his cabin, where Victoria insisted on cooking dinner despite her fatigue. Word spread quickly through Santa Rosa about Victoria's situation. Some, like Mrs. Carmichael, kept their distance, clearly disapproving of her continued stay with Matthew. But others, to Victoria's surprise, began to stop by with offerings, a basket of preserves from the general store owner's wife, a handmade quilt from an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of town, carpentry services offered by the local blacksmith for her cabin. "I told you," Matthew said after the blacksmith left, "neighbors help neighbors here." "I never expected such kindness," Victoria admitted, folding the beautiful quilt. "Not after my first day in town. People were suspicious," Matthew explained. "Strangers sometimes bring trouble. But once they understood your situation, most decent folks came around." "Thanks to you," Victoria pointed out. "They respect you here." Matthew shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise. I've lived here long enough to earn their trust, that's all." As December progressed, work began on Victoria's cabin. Matthew organized the efforts, coordinating the men who volunteered their time. The roof was repaired, windows replaced, walls sealed against the winter cold. Inside, the single room was cleaned thoroughly, a new cast iron stove installed, and simple furniture constructed: a bed, a table with chairs, shelves for provisions. Victoria spent her days dividing her time between helping at the cabin site and maintaining Matthew's home. She mended his clothes, cooked meals, and kept his small cabin cleaner than it had likely ever been. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking long into the night. She learned that Matthew had come west after losing his wife and infant son to fever during the war while he was away fighting. He had wandered for years before settling in Santa Rosa, building his horse ranch from nothing. "I couldn't stay in Kentucky," he explained one night, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Too many memories." "I understand," Victoria said softly. "After Thomas died, I couldn't bear our rented rooms anymore. Everything reminded me of him." Matthew nodded. "Does it get easier?" he asked, a rare vulnerability in his voice. Victoria considered the question carefully. "Not easier," she said finally. "Just different. The pain changes, becomes part of you rather than overwhelming you." They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Victoria found herself studying Matthew's profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands, so strong and capable, could also be infinitely gentle when helping her down from a horse or passing her a cup of tea. She turned away quickly when he caught her looking, a flush warming her cheeks. These feelings were unexpected and complicated. Thomas had been gone only 3 months, and here she was noticing another man. The guilt was immediate and sharp. Matthew seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's getting late," he said, rising from his chair. "We should both get some rest." Victoria nodded, grateful for his tact. "Good night, Matthew." As she lay in her bed that night, the baby restless within her, Victoria confronted her conflicted emotions. Was it disloyal to Thomas to feel this growing attachment to Matthew? Or was it simply human nature, the heart's instinct to seek connection even in grief? She had no answers, only questions that followed her into uneasy dreams. Christmas approached, bringing a festive atmosphere to Santa Rosa despite the winter chill. The general store displayed candy canes and small toys, and pine boughs decorated many of the buildings along the main street. Victoria's cabin was nearly complete, a Christmas miracle, as the blacksmith's wife called it, and she would be able to move in after the new year. Matthew invited her to attend the town's Christmas celebration with him, a gathering at the small church followed by a community meal. Victoria hesitated, aware of the gossip that still circulated despite most people's acceptance of her presence in town. "We don't have to go," Matthew said, noting her reluctance. "We could have our own celebration here." "No," Victoria decided, straightening her shoulders. "I want to go. This is my home now. I need to become part of the community." Matthew smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her heart flutter. "Brave as always, Mrs. Hayes." The church was decorated with evergreen boughs and candles, filling the simple space with fragrant warmth. Victoria felt eyes on her as she entered with Matthew, but she held her head high. Her condition was impossible to hide now, her baby due in less than 2 months, but she refused to be ashamed. She was a widow, not a woman of loose morals, regardless of what some might think. The service was lovely, with familiar carols and a message of hope from the young preacher. Afterward, tables were arranged in the adjoining meeting hall, laden with food brought by everyone in attendance. To Victoria's surprise, Mrs. Carmichael approached her as she helped arrange plates. "Mrs. Hayes," the older woman said stiffly, "I believe I owe you an apology." Victoria nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Carmichael's cheeks colored slightly. "I was hasty in my judgment. Mr. Crawford spoke highly of you and your late husband, and Mr. Westbrook." She glanced to where Matthew was helping move tables. "Well, he's always been a man of good character. If he vouches for you, that should have been enough." Victoria was momentarily speechless. "Thank you, Mrs. Carmichael," she finally managed. "Your apology means a great deal to me." The older woman nodded sharply. "Yes, well, we're a small community. We need to support one another." She hesitated, then added, "I lost my first husband young as well. It's a difficult road, especially with a child." With that surprising revelation, she moved away, leaving Victoria to process the unexpected moment of connection. Throughout the evening, more townsfolk approached her, offering kind words, advice about babies, or simply including her in conversation as if she had always been part of their community. Matthew stayed close by, a steady presence at her side, but gave her space to form her own connections. Victoria caught him watching her several times, a soft expression on his face that made her heart beat faster. As they walked home under a sky brilliant with stars, Victoria felt a contentment she hadn't expected to find again after Thomas's death. The night was bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds in the air, but Matthew had wrapped his warm coat around her shoulders, insisting he was fine in just his heavy flannel shirt. "I think that went well," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet night. Victoria nodded, smiling. "Better than I expected. Even Mrs. Carmichael apologized." Matthew chuckled. "Wonders never cease." They reached his cabin, and Matthew built up the fire while Victoria made hot chocolate, a luxury he had purchased specially for Christmas. As they sat before the fire, mugs warming their hands, Victoria felt a sudden sharp movement in her belly. "Oh," she gasped, her hand flying to the spot. Matthew was instantly alert. "What is it? Are you all right?" Victoria smiled reassuringly. "Yes, just the baby. Here." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it on her belly. "Wait a moment. There." The baby kicked again, strong enough that Matthew's eyes widened in wonder. "That's amazing," he said softly, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. Victoria suddenly realized the intimacy of the moment, Matthew's hand on her belly, their faces close together, the fire casting a golden glow over them both. She should move away, maintain propriety, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. Matthew seemed to realize it at the same moment. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had dared speak aloud. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. It was a question as much as a gesture of affection, and when they parted, Matthew searched her face anxiously. "I'm sorry," he began. "I shouldn't have." Victoria shook her head, cutting him off. "Don't apologize," she whispered. I've been wanting that too." Relief flooded his features, followed by a deeper emotion that made her breath catch. "Victoria," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I never expected to feel this way again. After Sarah died, I thought that part of me was gone forever." "I understand," Victoria said, taking his hands in hers. "I loved Thomas with all my heart. Losing him nearly destroyed me, but somehow being here with you." She struggled to find the right words. "It's as if my heart is learning to beat again." Matthew's thumbs brushed over her knuckles, a touch so tender it made her ache. "I don't want to rush you," he said earnestly. "You're still grieving." "So are you," she pointed out gently. "Perhaps we always will be in some ways, but I don't think that means we can't also find happiness again." Matthew nodded slowly. "What are you saying, Victoria?" She took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I care for you, Matthew, deeply. More than I thought possible after losing Thomas. And if you're willing to be patient with me as I navigate these feelings alongside my grief, I'd like to see where they might lead." The smile that broke across Matthew's face was like sunrise. "I can be very patient," he promised. "We have time." He kissed her again, and this time Victoria allowed herself to fully experience it without guilt or reservation. It was different from Thomas's kisses, not better or worse, just different, and she realized that was all right. Love could take many forms, and opening her heart to Matthew didn't diminish what she had shared with Thomas. When they finally said goodnight, Victoria retreated to her room with her mind spinning and her lips still tingling. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath. "Your father would want us to be happy," she whispered to her unborn child. "I believe that with all my heart." The days following Christmas brought heavy snow to Santa Rosa, delaying the final work on Victoria's cabin. She found she didn't mind. The time with Matthew was precious, their relationship unfolding gradually as they learned each other's habits, preferences, and histories. They were careful to maintain propriety in public, aware of the town's watchful eyes, but in the privacy of the cabin, they grew closer. Gentle touches, stolen kisses by the fire, long conversations that stretched into the night, all building a foundation of trust and affection that surprised them both with its strength. New Year's Eve arrived with clearing skies. Matthew suggested they ride out to Victoria's cabin to check on the progress, as no work had been done during the snowstorm. The ride was slow due to the deep snow and Victoria's increasingly unwieldy condition, but the crisp winter air felt wonderful after days confined indoors. The cabin looked transformed from when Victoria had first seen it. New windows gleamed in the sunlight, the roof was sound, and a proper door had replaced the broken one that had hung from a single hinge. Inside, the change was even more dramatic. The dirt floor had been replaced with wooden planks, the walls sealed and whitewashed, and the stone fireplace rebuilt. "It's beautiful," Victoria breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "I can't believe how much has been done." Matthew smiled, pleased by her reaction. "Just needs a few finishing touches. The stove will arrive next week, and then it will be ready for you and the little one." Victoria nodded, trying to summon enthusiasm. The cabin was everything she could have hoped for, safe, solid, hers, but the thought of leaving Matthew's home brought an unexpected pang. "What's wrong?" Matthew asked, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. Victoria sighed. "Nothing's wrong. The cabin is perfect, I just—" She hesitated, uncertain how to express her feelings without seeming forward. Matthew moved closer, taking her hands in his. "You just what?" "I've grown accustomed to your company," she admitted. "The thought of being here alone, especially at first with a new baby." Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. "Victoria," he said softly, "I have a proposition for you." Her heart quickened. "What sort of proposition?" "The kind that comes with a question." Matthew took a deep breath, then lowered himself carefully to one knee despite the rough wooden floor. "I know it's sudden, and I know you're still healing from losing Thomas. But these past weeks have shown me that life can offer second chances at happiness if we're brave enough to take them." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. "Victoria Hayes," Matthew continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "I've come to love you more than I thought possible. Your strength, your kindness, your courage in the face of adversity, all of it has captured my heart completely. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" A tear slipped down Victoria's cheek. "Matthew, are you certain? I come with complications." She gestured to her pregnant belly. "Another man's child, a child I would love as my own," Matthew interrupted firmly. "Victoria, I'm not proposing despite your pregnancy. Your baby is part of you, and I love all of you." Victoria felt as though her heart might burst with emotion. She had not expected to find love again, certainly not so soon after losing Thomas. Yet here it was, offered freely by a man whose goodness and character she had come to admire deeply. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." Matthew's face lit with joy as he rose to his feet and took her in his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to care for you both," he said, one hand gently touching her belly. "To protect and provide, to be the husband and father you deserve. And I promise to bring laughter and love back into your life," Victoria replied, her heart full. "To be the partner you've been missing." They sealed these promises with another kiss as the winter sun streamed through the cabin windows, casting golden light on this new beginning. News of their engagement spread quickly through Santa Rosa. Most received it positively, seeing it as a natural development of their arrangement and a proper resolution to any questions of propriety. A few raised eyebrows at the speed Victoria still visibly in mourning for her first husband, but Matthew's standing in the community silenced most critics. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with the young preacher officiating and most of the town in attendance. Victoria wore a modest blue dress that Mrs. Crawford had helped alter to accommodate her advanced pregnancy, and Matthew looked handsome in his best suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. The decision about where to live had been resolved pragmatically. They would remain at Matthew's cabin until after the baby was born, as it was closer to town and help if needed. Victoria's land would not go to waste. Matthew had already arranged to have a proper house built there in the spring, larger than either of their current dwellings, with room for their growing family. January turned to February, and Victoria's time drew near. Matthew became increasingly protective, rarely letting her out of his sight. He arranged for the doctor to check on her weekly and had a local midwife review their preparations multiple times. "You're going to wear yourself out with worry," Victoria teased him one evening as he fretted over whether they had enough clean linens prepared. Matthew gave her a rueful smile. "I can't help it. I want everything to be perfect for you and the baby." Victoria took his hand, placing it on her enormous belly where the baby was particularly active. "Feel that? That's a strong, healthy child. We're both going to be fine." Matthew nodded, though the worry didn't entirely leave his eyes. Victoria understood its source. He had lost his first wife in childbirth. That kind of fear didn't disappear easily, no matter how many reassurances the doctor provided. Her labor began in the early hours of a cold February morning. Matthew was instantly alert at her first gasp of pain, springing from bed to light lamps and stoke the fire. "I'll fetch the midwife," he said, already pulling on his boots. Victoria nodded through gritted teeth as another contraction gripped her. "Hurry." The hours that followed were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and determination. The midwife, a competent older woman named Martha, directed proceedings with calm efficiency. Matthew refused to leave Victoria's side despite Martha's initial attempts to banish him to the main room as was customary. "I'm staying," he said firmly, his hand gripped tightly in Victoria's. "Unless my wife asks me to go." Victoria, drenched in sweat and fighting through another contraction, managed to shake her head. "Stay," she gasped. "Need you." Martha shrugged. "Suit yourselves." Wouldn't be the first man to faint during a birthing. But Matthew didn't faint. He remained steady throughout, supporting Victoria's back when she needed to sit up, wiping her brow with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement in her ear when the pain seemed unbearable. As morning light began to filter through the windows, Victoria's ordeal reached its peak. "One more push," Martha instructed. "The head is crowning. That's it, girl, push." With a final, tremendous effort and a cry that seemed torn from the depths of her soul, Victoria felt the baby slide from her body. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a lusty, indignant wail. "A boy," Martha announced, quickly cleaning the infant's face and wrapping him in a prepared blanket. "A fine, healthy boy." She placed the squalling bundle in Victoria's arms. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, Victoria looked down at her son, red-faced, perfect, with a shock of dark hair plastered to his head. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her heart expanding with love. "Welcome to the world." Matthew leaned over them both, his face a study in wonder and love. "He's beautiful," he said hoarsely, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny fist, "just like his mother." Victoria looked up at her husband, seeing the tears in his eyes. "Would you like to hold your son?" Matthew's breath caught. "My son?" "Yes," Victoria said firmly. "You're his father now, in all the ways that matter." With careful movements, she transferred the baby to Matthew's arms. The sight of this strong man cradling her newborn son with such tender reverence brought fresh tears to Victoria's eyes. "What will we name him?" Matthew asked, not taking his eyes off the infant's face. Victoria had thought about this for months. "Thomas for his birth father," she said softly, "and Matthew for the father who will raise him." Matthew looked up, his expression one of stunned gratitude. "Thomas Matthew Westbrook," he said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Martha, who had been quietly tending to Victoria, smiled at the scene. "You've got yourself a fine family here, Mr. Westbrook. Take good care of them." "With every breath in my body," Matthew promised, his eyes moving between his wife and the child in his arms with fierce devotion. Little Thomas Matthew Westbrook, Tommy to his parents, thrived under their care. Victoria recovered quickly from the birth, surprising even Martha with her resilience. By spring, when the wildflowers began to carpet the plains around Santa Rosa, the small family had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Matthew's prediction had proven true. The town rallied around them, offering help and support during those early weeks. Even Mrs. Carmichael brought a handmade christening gown for Tommy's baptism, a peace offering that Victoria accepted graciously. As promised, construction began on their new home on Victoria's land when the weather warmed. Matthew designed it carefully, incorporating elements Victoria had mentioned, wanting a large kitchen with windows that caught the morning light, a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings, and a separate bedroom for Tommy with space for future siblings. Future siblings. Victoria had questioned with raised eyebrows when he mentioned this feature. Matthew had blushed slightly, the color endearing on his tanned face. "If you want more children someday," I thought. I hoped. Victoria had silenced his stammering with a kiss. "I would like that very much," she assured him, "though perhaps not for a year or two." The house was completed by early summer, a testament to the skill and dedication of their neighbors who contributed labor alongside the hired carpenters. Moving day arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for transporting their belongings the short distance from Matthew's cabin to their new home. Victoria stood in the doorway of the completed house, Tommy sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, and felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was the fulfillment of a dream, not exactly as she had imagined it with Thomas, but beautiful in its own right. Different, but no less precious. Matthew came up behind her, wrapping his arms around both her and Tommy. "What do you think, Mrs. Westbrook? Is it everything you hoped for?" Victoria leaned back against his solid chest, drawing strength and comfort from his presence. "It's more," she said truthfully. "So much more." They stood together in the doorway of their new home, a family forged through loss and found in kindness, looking out at the land that would sustain them and the community that had embraced them. The journey had not been what Victoria expected when she arrived in Santa Rosa 6 months earlier, pregnant and widowed, desperate for shelter as winter approached. But as Matthew's arms tightened around her and Tommy stirred against her shoulder, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm on the Westbrook ranch. Matthew continued his horse business, expanding it with Victoria's encouragement. The property that had once been Victoria's alone became truly theirs, with fields of hay to feed the horses, a large vegetable garden that Victoria tended with pride, and a small orchard of apple and cherry trees they planted together that first summer. Tommy grew from a newborn to an active toddler, bringing joy and laughter to their home. He had his mother's delicate features, but showed signs of developing his birth father's height and build. Matthew doted on him completely, teaching him about horses as soon as he could walk, carrying him on his shoulders around the property, and reading to him every night before bed. Victoria watched their bond deepen with grateful wonder. Matthew never once treated Tommy as anything less than his own flesh and blood. When people in town commented on how lucky Tommy was to have Matthew as a father, Matthew would always correct them gently. "I'm the lucky one." Their family grew in the summer of 1881 when Victoria gave birth to their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Westbrook. Matthew wept openly when he held her for the first time, overwhelmed by emotions both joyful and bittersweet. They had agreed to name her after his first wife and Victoria's mother, honoring the past while celebrating their future. "She has your eyes," Victoria told Matthew as they admired their newborn daughter. "And your spirit, I'd wager," he replied with a smile. "Heaven help us when these two are older." Tommy, not quite 2.5, regarded his baby sister with solemn curiosity. "Baby," he declared, gently patting her blanket-wrapped form. "My baby." "That's right," Matthew told him, ruffling his dark hair. "You're a big brother now." "That's an important job." As the years passed, the Westbrook family became a cornerstone of the Santa Rosa community. Victoria's natural warmth and Matthew's quiet strength made their home a gathering place for neighbors and friends. They hosted harvest celebrations in the fall, Christmas parties in the winter, and picnics by the creek in summer. Victoria never forgot her first days in Santa Rosa, the closed doors, the suspicious glances, the desperation she had felt. That memory fueled her determination to ensure no one in need was ever turned away from their door. Their home became known as a place of refuge for travelers, a temporary haven for those down on their luck, and a source of support for new settlers. "You've changed this town," Matthew told her on their 5th anniversary as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, their children playing in the yard. "Made it kinder." Victoria smiled, taking his hand. "We changed it together." Matthew shook his head. "It was you, Victoria. You showed everyone, including me, what true strength looks like. Not the kind that builds walls, but the kind that opens doors." Victoria leaned against her husband's shoulder, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From the darkest moment of her life, widowed, pregnant, and alone, had come this abundance of love and belonging. She thought of Thomas sometimes, especially when Tommy did something that reminded her of him. But those memories no longer brought only pain. They were tempered with gratitude for the time they'd shared and the son he had given her. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, his arms secure around her shoulders. Victoria smiled up at him, this man who had opened his door and his heart when she needed it most. "I'm thinking how fortunate I am," she said simply, "to have found you, to have this life, these children, to have a second chance at happiness." Matthew's eyes, still as kind and blue as the day they met, crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Not half as fortunate as I am," he assured her, bending to kiss her softly. "Every day with you is a blessing I never thought I'd have again." From the yard came the sound of their children's laughter, bright and clear in the evening air. Sarah, now 4, was chasing fireflies with determined concentration, her blonde curls bouncing. 8-year-old Tommy was helping her, his patience with his little sister one of his most endearing qualities. "Mama, Papa, look how many we caught," Sarah called, running toward them with a jar illuminated by the intermittent glow of imprisoned lightning bugs. "That's quite a collection," Matthew approved as both children climbed onto the porch. "But remember what we agreed about letting them go before bedtime." Tommy nodded solemnly. "They need to be with their families too." Victoria exchanged a smile with Matthew at their son's thoughtfulness. "That's right, sweetheart. Everything deserves to find its way home." As darkness fell completely, they released the fireflies together, watching the pinpricks of light disperse into the night. Matthew gathered Sarah, drowsy now, into his arms while Victoria took Tommy's hand. "Time for bed, my loves," she said. "Tomorrow's another day." As they walked into their home, warm light spilling from the windows onto the porch, Victoria felt a profound sense of contentment. The path that had led her to Matthew's door that cold December day had been marked by loss and hardship, but it had ultimately brought her to where she was always meant to be. The pregnant widow who had been turned away from every door in town had found not just shelter, but a home. Not just safety, but love. Not just an ending, but a beautiful new beginning. And as she tucked her children into bed that night, with Matthew by her side, Victoria knew with unshakable certainty that sometimes when one door closes, another opens if only we have the courage to knock, and if someone inside has the heart to say, "Welcome."